The room went dead quiet the moment I stepped through those doors. I felt it before I saw it. That shift in the air, the way conversation stops and bodies turn. The bailiff paused mid-step. The clerk looked up from her papers, and at the front of the courtroom behind that wide oak bench, Judge Harold Peirce froze with his pen hovering an inch above the page. He was staring at the badge on my belt. I didn't rush. I walked to the respondent's table the same way I'd walked into 100 situations where everything could go wrong. Slowly, deliberately, eyes forward. I set my folder down. I pulled out the chair, and I sat. From across the aisle, my brother leaned over to his attorney and whispered something. The attorney glanced at me, then looked away. My father, seated in the gallery behind my brother's table, let out a short laugh. Not loud, just enough for me to hear, the kind of laugh that says, "You really think that's going to work?" My mother didn't laugh. She pressed her lips together and looked down at her hands. I knew that look. She'd been giving it to me since I was 17 years old and told her I'd applied to the DEA training program instead of the nursing school she'd already picked out for me. I opened my folder and waited. I had 12 years of waiting practice. A few more minutes wasn't going to break me. My name is Rachel Mercer. I'm 31 years old and I grew up on 42 acres of red clay farmland outside Lubbock, Texas. The kind of place where the wind comes at you sideways in January and the summers burn so hot the asphalt bubbles on the county road. My grandfather built that land up from nothing. Bought the first parcel in 1961, added to it piece by piece over 4 decades, raised cattle and sorghum and 3 sons who eventually left for easier lives in the city. My father was the youngest of those sons. He came back, though. He always said the land called him home. What he never said was that he only came back after my grandfather made it financially worth his while. When my grandfather died 6 years ago, he left a will. Clear, notarized, witnessed by 2 people. The farmhouse and the primary 42 acres went to me. His oldest grandchild, the one who'd spent every summer there since I was 4, the one who knew every fence line and water table and the name of every county inspector who'd ever set foot on that property. My father said the will was drafted under duress. My brother said my grandfather had already promised the land to him verbally. Their attorney filed a motion to contest. And so here we were, a Tuesday morning in March, in a courtroom in Lubbock County, because my family had decided that 12 years of my absence was enough reason to take what my grandfather meant for me to have. What they didn't know, what I'd never told them, not once in all those years, was exactly where I'd been. I'd been recruited out of Texas A&M by a federal agent who came to campus during my senior year. I was 22, majoring in criminal justice, and I'd written a thesis on cartel financial networks that apparently made its way to a few people it wasn't meant to. The agent sat across from me in a conference room and said, "We have a position that would suit someone with your particular combination of skills. It would require you to relocate, work under a non-disclosure agreement, and accept that you cannot discuss your work with family or friends." I said yes before he finished the sentence. The next 12 years were not something I can fully describe, even now. I worked deep cover operations across the southwest border corridor. I built identities from scratch. Names, histories, relationships, jobs, and I inhabited them for months at a time. I watched people I'd grown to genuinely like get arrested. I testified in closed federal hearings. I relocated 7 times. I missed my cousin's wedding, my grandmother's funeral, my brother's daughter being born. My family knew I worked for a government agency in an administrative capacity. That was the cover story, and I stuck to it even on holidays, even when my mother begged me to explain why I could never talk about what I actually did, even when my father told me that a real job meant being somewhere your family could reach you. I sent birthday cards. I called when I could. I wired money home twice when I knew my parents were struggling, anonymously, through a routing that couldn't be traced back to me. They never knew it was from me. I left the agency 8 months ago. Not because I wanted to. A mission went sideways in a way I'm not at liberty to detail, and my cover identity was compromised beyond repair. My supervisor called it an operational transition. I called it the hardest morning of my life, handing in credentials I'd carried for over a decade. I came home to find the legal notice taped to my grandfather's farmhouse door. The attorney my brother had hired was named Jeffrey Stalls. He was from Dallas, wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent, and had the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered to him. He stood up first, buttoned his jacket, and smiled at Judge Pierce the way men like him smile at judges, like they're already on the same side. "Your Honor," he said, "what we have here is a straightforward matter of an estate contested on the grounds of undue influence and the testator's documented cognitive decline in the final year of his life. My client, Daniel Mercer, was the individual who provided daily care and support to the late Raymond Mercer during that period. He managed the property finances, coordinated medical appointments, and maintained the land through its most difficult years. The respondent, by contrast," he paused, glanced at me, "was absent for the entirety of that period and has been largely unreachable by the family for the past 12 years. He sat down. The judge looked at me. "Ms. Mercer, you're representing yourself today?" "Yes, Your Honor." A small sound from the gallery. My father, shifting in his seat, "You understand you have the right to counsel?" "I do." I waived it. Judge Pierce steadied me for a moment. His eyes moved briefly to the badge on my belt, a habit I suspected from years on the bench. Then he nodded. "You may proceed." I stood up. I didn't have a tablet or a presentation. I had a folder, a set of documents, and 12 years of learning how to make a case with exactly what was in front of me. Your Honor, I'd like to start with the will itself. I'd read my grandfather's will so many times in the past 8 months that I could recite it word for word. It had been drafted by an attorney in Lubbock named Charles Brandt, who had represented my grandfather for over 20 years. The signatures were dated 14 months before my grandfather's death. Well outside the window my brother's attorney was trying to use to establish cognitive decline. The two witnesses were my grandfather's neighbor, Earl Dawson, and his longtime accountant, Patricia Voss. I submitted the original document, the notarization records, and statements from both witnesses. Then I submitted the medical records. My grandfather had been seen by his physician, Dr. Trieber, Margaret Chu, every 6 weeks in the final 2 years of his life. I had obtained those records through a formal request. Dr. Non. Chu's notes from the period during which the will was drafted consistently documented a patient who was, in her words, oriented, communicative, and demonstrating clear recall of personal history and financial matters. There was no cognitive decline. There had been arthritis. There had been a managed heart condition. There had been, in his final months, a grief so heavy it bent him sideways. My grandmother had died 9 months before he did, and he never really recovered from that. But his mind had been his own until the last week of his life. Jeffrey Stalls objected twice during my presentation. Judge Pierce overruled him both times. My father's expression in the gallery had stopped being amused about 10 minutes in. My brother was staring at the table. I kept going. The harder part was the claim about care. My brother's attorney had framed Daniel Mercer, my brother, as the devoted family member who had sacrificed to be present, to manage the property, to support our grandfather through his final years. The implication was clear. I had been absent and therefore forfeited any moral claim regardless of what the will said. It was a smart argument. It was also mostly fabricated. I had records. I had the property tax filings from the 6 years before my grandfather's death. My brother had paid them twice. I had paid them anonymously through the same routing I'd used to send money to my parents 4 times. I could not disclose the source at the time, but I had documentation of the transfers that could now be verified. I had repair invoices, the well pump that failed in 2019, the barn roof, the irrigation line that cracked in the east field. My grandfather had called a contractor named Hector Villanueva, who had sent my grandfather a bill, and that bill had been paid by a wire transfer from an account that I could now prove was mine. My brother had visited the farm 11 times in 6 years. I had phone records and my grandfather's own personal journal, which I'd found in the farmhouse when I returned, documenting every visit, every call, every check. My grandfather had also written about me in that journal. I hadn't planned to use it, it felt private, but I'd brought it, and when Jeffrey Stalls stood up and said, in his smoothest voice, that my grandfather had expressed, in the final months of his life, a sense of abandonment regarding his granddaughter Rachel, I opened the folder to the page I'd marked. Your Honor, I'd like to submit an excerpt from Raymond Mercer's personal journal, dated October 14th, 2 years before his passing. Judge Pierce looked at me. Go ahead. I read it. Rachel called again tonight. Can't tell me much? Never can. But she asked how the East Field was holding up, and whether I'd had Villanueva look at the pump yet. Knows this place better than anyone. Worries about it the way I do. I know people wonder why I left it to her. They don't understand. She's the only one who ever loved it the same way I did. The courtroom was very quiet. I closed the folder. I have the original journal available for verification if the court requires it. Jeffrey Stalls asked for a recess. Judge Pierce granted 15 minutes. I stayed at my table. I drank some water. I looked at my folder and didn't look at the gallery, because I already knew what I'd see there, and I didn't need to see it right now. A hand touched my shoulder. I turned. It was Earl Dawson, my grandfather's neighbor, 81 years old, who had driven 40 minutes from his ranch to be here today. I hadn't asked him to come. He'd called me 2 weeks ago and said, I'm going to be there, Rachel. You don't have to do this alone. He didn't say anything now. He just squeezed my shoulder once and went back to a seat. That was enough. When court resumed, something had changed in the room. Jeffrey Stalls was quieter. He made a few more motions, challenged the admissibility of the journal, questioned the chain of custody on the wire transfer records. Judge Pierce considered each one carefully and denied them. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. I heard the murmur before I turned around. 2 people had entered and taken seats in the back row. A man in a dark suit and a woman in a gray blazer. I recognized them both. The man was Assistant Director Paul Wentworth of the DEA's Southwest Division. The woman was my former supervisor, Agent Diane Castillo. They had not been subpoenaed. I had not asked them to come. I told Diane about the hearing, once in passing, because she'd asked how I was doing in my first months out of the field. I hadn't thought anything of it. Paul Wentworth caught my eye and gave a single nod. I turned back around. My heart was doing something complicated in my chest. Judge Pierce had noticed the new arrivals. He looked at me. Ms. Mercer, do you have additional witnesses you intend to call? I wasn't planning on it, Your Honor. These individuals, he gestured toward the back. They're colleagues, I said. Former colleagues. Jeffrey Stalls was looking at them now. He leaned over to my brother and said something. My brother frowned and shook his head. Your Honor, Stalls said carefully, may I ask the nature of these individuals' affiliation? Before I could answer, Paul Wentworth stood up from the back row. He was not a man who needed to speak loudly to fill a room. Assistant Director Paul Wentworth, Drug Enforcement Administration. We're here in an observational capacity, Counselor. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. My father had turned fully around in his gallery seat to look at the 2 federal agents in the back of his son's courtroom. I didn't turn around to see his expression. I didn't need to. My brother was very still. Jeffrey Stalls sat down slowly. Judge Pierce called for final statements at 2:15 in the afternoon. Stalls kept his brief. The confidence had gone out of it. He made his remaining arguments about the emotional weight of physical presence, about what it means to be there for family, but his voice had lost its easy authority. He sat down and shuffled his papers. I stood up for the last time. Your Honor, I want to address one thing directly, because it's been implied throughout today's proceeding and I think it deserves a straight answer. I paused for a moment. I was absent, that's true. For 12 years, I was not at family dinners. I did not attend most holidays. I could not explain what I did or where I was. I understand how that looked. I understand why my family interpreted it the way they did. If I were in their position, I might have drawn the same conclusions. I heard something shift in the gallery behind me. I kept going. But absence is not abandonment, and silence is not indifference. I did what I could, in the ways I was able to, within constraints I could not disclose. My grandfather understood that better than anyone. He knew I loved that land. He knew why I'd left, and that I hadn't left it behind. I closed my folder. The will reflects his wishes clearly and legally. I'm asking the court to uphold them. I sat down. Judge Pierce took 3 days to issue his ruling. I spent those 3 days at the farmhouse. I'd been staying there since I returned. The house was still standing, still structurally sound, though it needed work. I'd already replaced a window in the back bedroom. I'd cleared the brush from the fence line on the east side. I'd found Hector Villanueva's number in a drawer and left him a message about the well pump, which had started making noise again. On the second evening, my mother called. I almost didn't answer. I sat there looking at her name on the screen for 4 rings, and then I picked up. She didn't apologize. I hadn't expected her to. That wasn't how she operated, and at 31 I'd made a kind of peace with that. But she said, "I didn't know about the money. Your father didn't either." A pause. The repairs. It doesn't matter. It does, she said. It does matter. There was a long silence. Outside the farmhouse window, the sun was going down over the west field, turning the red clay almost gold for a few minutes, the way it did every evening in March. "Grandpa knew," I said. "I know he knew," she said quietly. "He told me once, before he died. I thought he was confused." She wasn't ready to say more than that. Neither was I. We stayed on the line for another minute without speaking, which was its own kind of language between us, and then she said she'd call again soon, and we hung up. The ruling came in on a Thursday afternoon. Judge Pierce upheld the will. He cited the absence of credible evidence for cognitive decline at the time of drafting, the documented financial contributions to the property that contradicted the narrative of abandonment, and the witness testimony supporting the testator's clear intent. He noted in a single line near the end of his written ruling that the court had found the respondent's presentation unusually thorough and credible. I read it once at the kitchen table, set it face down on the wood my grandfather had sanded himself 50 years ago, and looked out the window for a long time. I wasn't happy exactly. Happy wasn't the right word for any of this. It was more like the feeling after a long operation finally closes. The relief is real, but you're too tired to celebrate, and there's too much that can't be undone. I called Diane. She picked up on the second ring. "We won," I said. "Of course you did," she said. "You had the strongest case in the room. You didn't have to come. I wanted to." A pause. "How are you?" "Tired," I said. "Good." "Tired," I said. "Good." Tired and good. My brother called 2 weeks later. Not Jeffrey Stalls, not a formal communication. My actual brother, Daniel, from his own phone on a Sunday evening. I was outside fixing the irrigation line in the east field, the one that had cracked again, and I almost missed it. I answered. He didn't say much. He said he'd been wrong about some things. He said their father had gotten into his head about the property and he'd let himself believe a version of events that was easier than the truth. He said he was sorry. I sat down on the dry ground with the irrigation pipe in my hand and listened. He asked about my job, what I could tell him, which wasn't much, but more than before. I told him about the training program, the early years, a few things that had already been declassified. He was quiet in a way that sounded like he was working something out. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I know you didn't. Why didn't you tell us, even a little?" "I couldn't," I said. It wasn't a choice I was making about whether to trust you. It was the job, the rules." Another long silence. "I get it," he said. I'm not sure he fully did, but he was trying, and that meant something. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular. His daughter's school play, whether the county was going to repave the South Road, what I was planning to do with the East Field. By the time we hung up, it wasn't fixed. Things like this don't get fixed in one phone call. But the door was open. That was more than it had been. My father never called. I'd expected that. And I'd made my own kind of peace with it. There are some people who can admit when they've been wrong. And some people who process that admission privately and silently. And you only see it in the small things. Years later. I don't know yet which kind my father is. Maybe I'll find out. What I know is this. In early April, about 3 weeks after the ruling, I drove past the west fence line and found it had been repaired. New post, fresh wire. Clean work. I hadn't done it. There was only one other person with a key to the gate. I parked the truck and got out and stood there looking at it for a while. The afternoon was warm, first real warmth of spring, and the land smelled like it always had. Dry and alive and like something that had been waiting. I didn't call him. I didn't leave a note. I went back to the house, made coffee, and sat on the porch until the sun went down. Some things don't need words. The land had known that long before either of us got here, and it would know it long after we were both gone. My grandfather understood that. I think he always knew I did too. That's why he left it to me.